The Porter Phelps Huntington farmstead that houses this local history museum occupies the homeland of Pecumtuck, Nonotuck, Mohawk, Nipmuc, and Mohican peoples, displaced by the arrivals of European families like the Porters, who came to Hadley in the 17th century and built this house in 1752. The museum recognizes the responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of this land, as well as the histories of dispossession, alongside enslavement that generated the wealth reflected in this historic house and museum. Using collections, interpretation, programming, and through collaborative relationships, the Porter Phelps Huntington Museum is working to examine, address, and reflect on these difficult but necessary histories. This series, Bridging the Past and Present, is part of that process. It's supported by a Bridge Street grant from Mass Humanities, whose mission is to lead and support humanities programs to improve civic life in Massachusetts. Mass Humanities work is made possible by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Mass Cultural Council, and the generosity of their donors. This summer, the Porter Phelps Huntington Museum remains closed for tours and on-site programming, but we're delighted to be able to offer these bridging presentations about the history of this place and the many generations of diverse peoples who lived and worked here. The National Scenic Byway Trail System that begins at the museum is staying open for hikers this summer. And while closed to visitors, the museum's wonderful group of summer interns are busily engaged in an array of preservation and reinterpretation projects so as to be ready to tell more and different stories when we reopen next summer. So we hope to see you in person in the summer of 2022. I'm Karen Sánchez-Eppler. I'm a professor of American Studies and English at Amherst College and newly president of the board of the Porter Phelps Huntington Foundation. And I'll be giving the next of these summer virtual presentations on July 7th. Same time, same Zoom link. I'll be talking then about the mid-19th century and the third and fourth generation of occupants of this house, and particularly about childhood and schooling. If you appreciate this place and the work we're striving to do and enjoy today's free programming, we hope you'll use the donation button right there on the Porter Phelps Huntington website to make a donation in support of the museum. And it's now my enormous pleasure to introduce Marla Miller and to take this occasion to talk with her about her long history of research in the Porter Phelps Huntington collection, and especially her wonderful new book, Entangled Lives, Labor, Livelihood, and Landscapes of Change in Rural Massachusetts, came out at the very end of 2019. And just for anyone who loves this place, just a total delight and revelation to sit and read. So strongly recommend it. And I think at the end of today, you will all, in fact, feel that way as well. So in 2020, the Massachusetts Historical Commission received one of only 18 underrepresented community National Park Service grants to update the National Register nomination for the Porter Phelps Huntington House and the Phelps Farm property across the street, so as to include information about underrepresented communities. Marla is also the principal investigator for that project. And in several books and more than a dozen articles, she's surfaced and explored social relations of work among Black, Native, and white women in rural New England. Her books, The Needle's Eye, Women in Work in the Age of Revolution, Betsy Ross and the Making of America, and her biography of gown maker Rebecca Dickinson, all document the labor of needlework. She's edited the collection Cultivating a Past, Essays in the History of Hadley, Massachusetts, which gathered published and new research on this rural community. Both her first book and Entangled Lives draw centrally on Porter Phelps Huntington materials and records. Marla consults with a wide variety of museums and historic sites. Imperiled Promise, the State of History in the National Park Service, a report that she co-authored for the Organization of American Historians, won the National Council on Public History Award for Excellence in Consulting. and as a longtime director of the History Department's Public History Program at the University of Massachusetts. Professor Miller teaches courses in public history, American material culture, and museum and historic site interpretation. Marla and I will start this conversation for the next half hour or so, and then we'll open it up for questions, the most exciting part. And I think I'm going to just start by asking Marla to tell us something about her long research relationship to the Porter Phelps Huntington Museum collections and how she got interested in these Hadley women.
Yeah. Well, first I want to say, thank you, Karen, for that introduction, and thanks to the museum for hosting this conversation. I'm glad that we're having a conversation instead of just listening to me talk, and I look forward to hearing your questions and the questions that folks bring to this this exchange. And I also want to say, well, I'll get to this, but I want to thank Sue Lisk right at the top. I met with the students at the museum the other day, and we were talking about how long we had known each other, and I did the math today, and it's close to 30 years that I have been involved one way or another with Porter Phelps Huntington House. So it's just really a pleasure to be here virtually with you all, and I look forward to the day we are all in the sunken garden and enjoying that the beautiful grounds there. So to answer Karen's question, I came to the site, I think, through a circuitous route, but also one that, just builds on the expertise of my various mentors. But when I was an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin, one of my most beloved professors recommended that I come out and do the Historic Deerfield Summer Fellowship Program. And, I was a very, very shy student. I never spoke in class. I took 3 classes with that man, and I don't know that I ever spoke in class. And so when he brought an opportunity to me, I thought, well, I should pursue that, so that he knows I'm a serious and engaged student, since he can't tell from me in the classroom. And I came out to do the summer fellowship program at Deerfield, had a magical summer. And in the course of that program, all the students are expected to do individual research. And there is a diary there that at that time was still in family hands, that had a little bit of evidence about my research topic at the time, which was on the distinct lives of ministers' wives in early America. And this diary, the diarist, Rebecca Dickinson, palled around a little bit with the minister's wife in Hatfield, so that I just used it enough to get some insight into that world. And at the end of the summer, Kevin Sweeney, retired now from Amherst College, and then the director of academic programs at Historic Deerfield, suggested that if a student wanted to take it on, the diary as a topic, maybe we could get it microfilmed and, start a conversation about getting it preserved. And so the prospect of being the first person to look at a diary, no matter what the diary was about, was so exciting to me as an undergraduate that I said, short of that, like whatever it is, I will write about it. And that is advice that I still give students today. Like, sometimes it can be more productive to just find a source that's interesting and write about whatever it has to say than to have a specific topic that you then have to find material that speaks to. So I took that diary, the copy of it, back to Wisconsin and spent my senior year transcribing it, and wound up writing a senior thesis and then a master's thesis on the story that document revealed, which is about what it was like to be a never married woman in a culture that really had no room for women outside, marriage and family. And so I always say Rebecca Dickinson is my history best friend. I love her. I've come to love her over the years. And in the course of that work, I wanted to get to know how she supported herself. And you could see in the diary, she made a few references to her work as a gown maker. So I learned that much. And so I started thinking about writing about women in skilled trades in early America. And again, Kevin Sweeney came to the rescue and said, well, there's another diary from a woman who lived across the street or across the river from Rebecca Dickinson. And, you might check the diary of Elizabeth Porter Phelps. And so I, hightailed it to the published version of that, and could immediately see, like, not only is Rebecca Dickinson all over that document, but, just dozens of other needlewomen and domestic servants and weavers and just this whole world of women in work opened up to me at that time. So that was a big part of it. I was down at North Carolina at that time and just kind of fell in love with this community of women in New England. And I'll add to that just a layer in the scholarship of that moment. I was in graduate school in the early 90s. And at that time, in sort of the broad brush evolution of women's history as a field, women's history emerged in the 1970s and 1980s. And of course, a lot of that was trying to document how women's lives differed from men's. And just at the time I was in graduate school, there had been a flourishing new scholarship on how women's lives were different from one another's, that white women lived one kind of a life, Black women might live another kind of a life. And so there was a big conversation afoot about difference. But just at that moment, at a big conference that happened, I think at Duke at that time, a scholar named Elsa Barclay Brown asked a new question. And she said, what difference does difference make? And it introduced this idea that it's not enough to observe that different women have different lives and different opportunities. What we need to be doing is thinking about how the opportunities of some people create constraints for others. And that really was powerful to me at the time, because what I could see in my sources in the Elizabeth Porter Phelps diary is that there's this whole world of women that at first glance looked very similar. They're all fourth generation New Englanders. They all belong to the same church, but their lives and opportunities are really different. And so that's what really drew me into it. I really wanted to dig into this community and develop an understanding of how women's lives then, as they are now, can be very different from each other's.
So it's so moving to me that you sort of came to Elizabeth Porter Phelps through Rebecca Dickinson rather than the other way around, and sort of came to this project with a concern about the women who worked in the houses, rather than about the owners of the houses. And of course, like initially the museum was founded as the Porter Phelps Huntington Museum to celebrate that family and its lineage, and in some ways all those papers are saved out of that impetus. And I would be lovely to have you, I guess it's almost to ask the other question, like what's happened now? And one of the things that's really, Entangled Lives is about the entanglement, right? That it does include both Elizabeth Porter Phelps as a source, but also as a different set of life choices and life possibilities. And so I guess thinking a little bit more about that entanglement.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me. One of the things that I've gotten very interested in the last, I don't know, say 3 or 4 years, is the history of public history practice right here in the Valley. In general also, but right here in the Valley, there's so many interesting stories. And so as I've been digging into this National Register project that we are just starting, as it happens just today, I reread a report that Laurel Thatcher Ulrich wrote when the museum in the 90s was doing
1992.
reinterpretation initiative. And it's shocking to me because her plea was, you should talk about the women more. And of course, in my mind now, and certainly in the wake of that reinterpretation initiative, like that site is all about the women. I mean, I now have to learn by research what James Lincoln Huntington, the museum founder, like what he was thinking about. And I have come to appreciate now that their agenda was very much around Frederick Dan Huntington, the celebrated bishop. Like for them, this was the house, not just of a celebrated male-headed New England family, but specifically, this very
Bishop Huntington's
house, specifically right. Bishop Huntington, which honestly, I'm only now registering that. Like, to me, in my experience with the house, it was so much about Elizabeth Porter Phelps and so much about the women who worked there. I mean, even when I first came on the scene, I feel like that was all very present. And so to see this document in the early 90s saying, you should make Elizabeth Porter Phelps more central. It's hard for me to even imagine a time before Elizabeth Porter Phelps was so central to that story. But it's fascinating to see those layers of community interest that in the conclusion to Entangled Lives, I talk a little bit about that, about Aria Huntington, who's one of the first to publish in the 1890s, and what her take on the house and its history is, and then how other generations come along. It's just like we have today. New generations come along, they have new concerns, new questions, they see the past differently, and they add their layer. So we are just in our moment adding our layer.
Well, and one of the things you talk about there is James Huntington saying, I don't want this barn at all, because the story I want to tell about the family is not an agricultural story. And so, all right, Clifton Johnson, take the barn.
Right. That's right.
I don't need the barn. You're going to take it to the center of Hadley and use it to make a farm museum. And in fact, you can take all the farm implements that you want, because that's not what, that's not what I'm memorializing here.
Yeah.
So there's a certain way in which, when we're thinking about what we're trying to do now at the museum, it's about like, how do you bring back things that actually James Huntington was actively working at removing from the story, right? From the story.
Yeah. So in the graduate program, we talk about this all the time, how you have to read against the grain. A source is created by a person at a time to do a thing, but our job now is to try to read between the lines, try to think about what haven't they said, or what are these sentences that appear to be at one thing, do they tell us about something else? And so in a way, I mean, as much as I love the Diary of Elizabeth Porter Phelps, it is a challenge because it's so complete and it's so exhaustive. And you just have to keep remembering that even though her story is so well documented, it can't stand in for all the other stories in town. Her experience, certainly in Hadley, is not typical, and so we have to work that much harder to see past the choices that James Lincoln Huntington made as a past keeper, which is a term I like, the choices Elizabeth Porter Phelps made as she decided what to record, what not to record, like all of that. Like, our job as historians is to try to end run all the players who are between us and the past and try to put it back together.
So one of the things, and another thing that I found so moving in this book, I guess all the sections about domestic service and the discussions about domestic service, but in particular, just the many stories of women working at 40 acres who either came with children or had children while they were there, and the complicated balancing acts and decisions that they made, back actually to the first generation as well for the enslaved women, but that in each of those cases, the really different strategies and choices that women had to make in terms of their efforts to take care of their children and their efforts to do the work that they were being required to do, and how to do those in the same spaces, or maybe send your child somewhere else. Yeah,
it was a constant calculus. It's easy to forget, there's no safety net in the 18th century. Like, you are working it out season to season and month to month. And so yeah, I find those stories really compelling too. There's a story in the book about this woman, Persis, who is a domestic servant, who becomes pregnant in the course of her work. And it's an issue for Charles and Elizabeth because it implies they aren't doing a good job of controlling their servants' behavior. She's having this baby out of wedlock. But for Persis, this is a problem that can be solved. And so Charles and Elizabeth are trying to decide, like, should we fire her? We really love her. Our kids love her. Everyone loves her, but we shouldn't approve. So they're going round and round. There's a sentence, I quote this all the time. Your father and I have talk about it and leave it just where we begun. And they just don't know what to do. But Persis comes to them and says, I've been in this situation before. I had a child when I worked at this large tavern, and my child was helpful and could go around and gather the candlesticks and bring them back for me to clean. And if you do the math on that, this child is a toddler. It's like a 2-year-old. And so the idea that she's, she can't lose this job. And so she's got to convince her employers that she can make it work, and she has made it work before. And so so that is a really moving story, and they wind up letting her stay. And there's another, like, talk about reading between the lines. There's a passage where Elizabeth records that Persis has delivered the baby, and apparently Elizabeth was not called. And we hear a lot in our historical understanding about women being gathered around the bed as women are giving birth, and Elizabeth, for whatever reason, was not with Persis. And you kind of imagine this this worker thinking, I just need this privacy. And maybe other women were called, we don't know, none of that is mentioned, but she managed to keep her employer at arm's length, at least for that moment, which I think is telling. But yes, other women decided to place their children with relatives so that they could hold their job. And then there's a lot of discussion in the record about them going back and forth to visit their child and how long can they be away and when they will be back. And then, of course, you mentioned the enslaved woman, Peg, who makes the very difficult decision to seek sale. So she comes to Charles and Elizabeth and says, will you sell me to this man in Vermont? Well, this other man in town, Pomp, is sold by the Warners to the same buyer so that they can marry, because Pomp's enslavers won't allow him to marry. And so she makes that choice, moves to Vermont while she has 2 children at 40 acres left behind. And she winds up coming back after a few years, and we don't know all the details of that story, but again, a very difficult decision about balancing autonomy and freedom and parenting. And we can only get so far into those stories. We think we can use our imagination to try to understand what those women were going through, but we can only ever know partial stories.
Yeah, the other one that really strikes me too is Submit West. And there, I mean, almost sort of the opposite of Elizabeth Phelps being closed out of the delivery room, because that's the other side too, as you hear in that line, is like, she's a little peeved, like, this is my house, this is my, I've been being a good mistress to you. What do you mean that you didn't invite me to be part of this process? But then also her desire to keep Submit West with her. Yeah, and I mean, the other thing that, so the short course for folks who haven't read the book is that this girl, Mittie West, is the daughter of, this is a big pattern in the family, domestic servants who become pregnant. And her mother is a servant, becomes pregnant, winds up leaving service to start her family up in, I think it's South Deerfield, but leaves Mittie behind. And Mittie becomes kind of a ward of the Phelps family, but her status is always very ambiguous. She's kind of a member of the family, but kind of not. And whether that contributes to this or not, she becomes, there are a lot of behavioral issues that get discussed in the family letters. And I can see where her status is so fraught. It must have been a difficult childhood.
And then in time, she also becomes pregnant outside of marriage. And in Hadley, in that period, it's what Elizabeth calls a shocking affair, because the child that's born is mixed race. And this, as far as we can see, severs the relationship pretty much between the Phelpses and Mitty in time. I mean, Charles drives her up to, I think her mother's in Ashfield at that time. And we lose track of Mitty a little bit in the historical record, but it's multi-generational. That's one of the things that, that I think we really have to attend to in this book, is it's not just relationships between people at the moment, because, you know, their parents knew their parents, their children know their children. It's all of these relationships are also multi-generational. They're much denser than you could even get into in the course of a book narrative, because everybody is entangled in many, many ways that go back over generations. So that family is entwined over 3 generations at least.
Right, and that's true, and that crosses class lines in all these interesting ways, and that you see both exploitation and you also see care.
Yes.
In ways that's surprising, and connection. So that, you know, that sort of the doubleness of Mitty's relationship is where you can see all the things that are really hard about that, but they also kept her.
Yeah.
You know?
I mean, I think I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think it's, you know, we just have to remember that the relationships in the past are not simple. And we all know in our own lives, like, you can be angry with someone and love them at the same time. Like, it's not like you have to choose one or the other. So these things are all afoot in the past too, and relationships evolve. You know, you can have a period where you're not, you know, they're not as in close touch with Mitty. Then she comes back into the family. Like, it's, you know, like, again, we all know in our own lives that those stories evolve and unfold over long periods of time. So there's, you know, they're not tidy, and we shouldn't expect them to be tidy.
So can I ask you to just talk a little bit, because I'm sure everybody's really curious about this, about research method things, about like how you find these stories and these people. So there is this, like, as you said, kind of comprehensive source in Phelps' diary. And then there are also lots of letters between family members. So that's one kind of record, but a very skewed one, I guess. And so if you could say more about how you start to find stories beyond what Elizabeth is interested in writing down.
Yeah. You know, I think sometimes it's really just like opening every box, you know, metaphorically. You just have to open them all and see what unfolds. I was telling before the event started, I was telling Susan and Karen that I just couldn't resist digging into our National Park Service work. And just to give an example from emerging research, so we are looking into both the family at 40 acres, but also the Phelpses across the street, which I have never had occasion to look into in my work, because my work tends to end about the time that household is set up. But, you know, you just notice things. So I was reading Charles Porter Phelps's autobiography. And, you know, I've read that before, you know, for different reasons, looking at different things. But, you know, every time you reread a document, you see things that you never really landed on before. And so he talks about when he's first trying to get into business, he's tries to make it as a lawyer. That doesn't really work out. And so he thinks, well, import, export, I'll try trade. And he has 200 boxes of sugar, Havana sugar, that he is going to try to sell in Rotterdam, I think it is, Holland. And so he ships it, and then the embargoes, Jefferson's embargoes of 1807 unfold, and he's he's kind of sunk. He comes back to Hadley, spends 15 months here trying to figure out what to do. That situation all, resolves. Meanwhile, his agent in Europe has got the sugar still, and because of the embargo, imported goods go sky high, and he winds up selling that at a very healthy profit just at the right moment. And so it got me thinking about Havana, and it's Havana sugar, that's how it's described. And what does that tell us about his entanglement in what scholars are now calling the Atlantic slave economy? We know how that sugar was harvested, and what does it mean that this is the beginning of his career as a businessman? And so that's a thread that I intend to follow. I've also, reading that document, he's got a business partner who I don't know anything about yet, who has come to Boston from Savannah. And so I'm interested to know more about that. So it's really just like, as you're reading along, like stopping at all the, I wonder what that is. And then seeing what you can do, push on every noun, every verb. Is there something behind that I can find? Is there something else there that I can see? So it's really just that, like just pausing at every word to say, like, what else might be there?
Well, and not only every word, because you've also been so wonderful about thinking about spaces and things. And
yeah, that's the magic of the house, right? Like, I don't know, what it is that gives us these feelings when you're in a historic environment or when you have that built fabric around you. But just this week, I walked through the house again, and Susan opened the door to a closet that I had sort of forgotten about. But years ago, Tom Paskey, who was, I don't know if he was on the board then, but he's an architectural conservator, showed me this artifact that I talk about a lot. It was very powerful for me at the time. It's a dark ring around the baseboards. Mm-hmm. And Tom explained to me that dark ring is there. It's evidence of many, many scrubbings. And like, I think that my heart just dropped when I heard that, because I knew, I've seen many, many references to the scouring out of the buttery, to the scrubbing of the floors. Many of those references are about Indigenous women employed by the household as domestic servants and the hard, dirty work that they did. That was hands and knees scrubbing out those floors. And so to feel like, some of these Indigenous women, I don't even know their name. They don't have any documents for me, but they left this artifact that, if nothing else, reminds me that they were there. And so, like, really looking at the fabric of a building can tell you things you might not think about. In the book, I think a lot about locks on doors, and I was noticing that again when I was back in the house, just thinking about who gets to go where in a house, who gets to get in what cupboard, and thinking about how the family, on the one hand needs to provide access to the house, and on the other hand, they want to protect pieces of it. So how do we think about, like, what's protected and what isn't, and who has access and who doesn't? But then, they're just funny stories. One of the Indigenous women, there's a great exchange in the correspondence where this Elizabeth Phelps is out of town. She's with her daughter who's going to have a baby, and they need to get making the cheese. And it's Charles Phelps, and it's this native servant at that time named, I think her name is Asana. They spell it different ways, and I'm not sure exactly what is correct, but they need these cheesecloths, and they know that Elizabeth bought cheesecloths, but no one knows where they are. And, so there's just kind of this, funny exchange where she's trying to tell them through the mail where to look, and then they write back and say, oh, it's not there, it's not there. But just thinking about all of those cubbies, all those cupboards and all the places the cheesecloths could be. But how did those spaces function in their day? Just sometimes just sitting in a space and thinking about what the implications of the space might be. How far is it from this space to that space? Or what are the other ways that we might imagine how that space was experienced?
Right, how could you go through it? So I'm thinking we should let other people ask you questions, even though I keep asking you questions. So Oscar, do you want to do your magic thing and just make it so people can unmute themselves? You're welcome if you don't want to speak to put questions into the chat, or you can raise your hand, and we're not an enormous group. You could also just start talking. Unmute yourself and start talking. Change, see if I can make a view to see people.
Well, since there's a pause, I see Rick and Mary Thayer on my screen. And so I'm going to wave hello to Rick and Mary. And I want to say, like, talk about research methods. You know, another way that a project like this happens is that you reach out to other people who hold historic material and see if they'll share it. And so there's a whole chapter in the book about women in tavern keeping, and it is based mightily on an account book that Rick and Mary steward that is just wonderful. If any students in the room are looking for a project, there's more to be done with that account book, and I would be happy to help you think of it, and have a historic building also in their care. So it's, you know, community members steward the past together. Like Porter Phelps Huntington is stewarding a big part of the past, but they're not the only people. Like we've already touched on the Farm Museum, the Historical Society holds stuff, but you know, families all over this town hold historical materials and are the stewards of it. And so we just have to be grateful for all of them. So I'm shout out to Rick and Mary, since you're right here on my screen.
Well, we're so grateful for you, Marla, for interpreting and spending the hours and hours and hours to take these documents and make them into a way we can appreciate them and understand them. So thank you.
Yeah, there's also a chapter on hospitality in the tavern keepers. So in the book.
I had a question about something that you said about reading against the grain, and I've been going through Elizabeth's diary in part of my research at PPH, and obviously that was something more in the back of my mind, not really pausing at every word like you said later, but can you speak a little bit more about what you keep in mind, particularly with Elizabeth? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of paying attention to what gets said, but also what doesn't get said, what kinds of information is not recorded, who doesn't show up in the account book that you might know, or the diary that you might know is on site through other sources. So is there a way to sort of puzzle out what she's deciding to share and what she's not deciding to share? A lot of it comes too, just thinking about sources, from thinking about the purpose of a document. And so one of the things that I often try to correct, I don't know why, but that document is often called her diary. And in my work, I always called it her memorandum book, because that's what she calls it. And there's this nice line where Charles wants to know something, or somebody needs to know, like, when a particular employee arrived. And she says, well, I've checked my records and I see that it's this date. And so for Elizabeth Porter Phelps, the purpose of that document is not reflection and introspection the way we think about diaries today. It's kind of more like a prose ledger of the work that gets done on the farm. So then part of it is also thinking about, you know, what's the purpose of this? What can I expect to find there? And what am I not going to find there? But then, like these documents always do, it evolves. And so there are some passages in that document that are anguished. You know, she is going through something big. Elizabeth Carlisle's book does a great job digging into some of those moments and speculating, like, what is happening here. But, you know, so the source starts out to be one thing, but sometimes it's something else. Sometimes it's a place she does need to do that kind of emotional outpouring that we associate with diaries. So it's also thinking about, like, what the what's happening here? What is she trying to record here? And then how does that help you see past it?
Yeah, Cliff, you need to unmute, I think.
Yeah, I'm muting myself. About transcribing documents or ledgers or diaries, how do you do it mechanically? Do you actually read it and then handwrite it or type it, or do you use a voice recognition program or anything like that?
Oh, thank you for asking that. No, I just key it in, which is tedious. I do think, we always have to pay attention to transcription, and with an eye toward error. So much of the Elizabeth Porter Phelps diary has been published, but I definitely have had to go back to the original because I'm not confident that the transcriber got something right, or I need to see the actual pages. So when using documents in transcription, you always have to go back to the original and make sure that nothing is amiss. But yeah, I've thought about like what a voice recorder, if I read it and used voice recognition, would that be faster? But I also think that something happens intellectually, like between the fingers and the brain, that actually might be valuable.
I have done some transcription using voice recognition software, and I don't know that it's saved much time in the end. It was easier, I think, than trying to key it all in. But when you were all finished, you had to go back and re-edit what the program heard. And in the end, it was still tedious, but it was just a different kind of tedious.
Yeah.
It depends too on the handwriting, because if the handwriting is difficult enough, then the process of figuring out is slow enough that you're better off typing, right? Like the sort of, it's almost like the process of doing that is the process of figuring out what this line said, who this is.
I don't know that the site is up anymore, but right after Laurel Ulrich published A Midwife's Tale, the filmmaker Laurie Kahn-Levitt made a companion site to the documentary, and on it there was this thing called the magic lens, and on the screen were the images of the original diary, but you could drag this magic lens over it and anything beneath the lens would appear in type. And I don't know, that's been a long time ago. That should be everywhere by now. I like, where is that? Because I think we all want that.
Right, but that was coded in because they had the whole transcription.
Yeah.
Right? There is some places on the American Antiquarian Society apprenticeship documents that have that too. It's a cool, it's a cool thing.
Yeah.
I guess I am interested too, when you're talking about the account books and things like that, and about the kind of information you feel like you're getting from them.
Oh yeah, I love financial records. I would advise anybody, don't be afraid of them. I mean, they do look scary, I think, at first glance, but like I am at my happiest with some 1780s account book in front of me. They're just like those transactions where you see see the labor people are actually doing and what they're able to secure for their labor. Account books are gold mines if you can sort of get, I think many of us freeze at math and financial records of all kinds. I feel like historians often make that confession, but the content of account books is so rich, as you see, just the everyday exchanges. And then they're just, a lot of random notes find their way into account books where people often record other sentiments and other things that they want to remember. And the account book's handy, so that's where it goes. And so, yeah, they're really worth digging into.
I love the story you were just telling about Havana Sugar and Charles Phelps, like today's discovery.
Yeah.
And it just was making me think about local history and the global.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and well, and I guess also, so partly this is a question about your decision. And I don't think I had realized that you were like in Wisconsin and North Carolina as you were falling in love with these Hadley women,
Yeah.
because, you know, like now you're living near them. So it sort of seemed like, oh, this must be like the research you do because you're at the University of Massachusetts, not
Other way around.
around. So I guess part of it is that sort of question of local history versus global history, or is it local history as global history?
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm so glad you asked that. Brief detour onto Betsy Ross, if I may. One of the things that most excites me about that whole Betsy Ross project is that people who only know Betsy Ross through the legend of the making of the first flag, all the things, the commemorative plates and the salt and pepper shakers and like all the stuff, all imagines her in her parlor and she's making this flag in her lap, right? And you know, she had a shop. Those flags were enormous. Like there was nothing domestic about that work. And so like I knew that part of it because I was interested in the craft angle. But when I got into her story, I came to appreciate how global her world was. So as I discovered that she made flags that, you know, like here's an order from New Orleans, here's an order from Niagara, here's an order from wherever. Like part of her livelihood was paying attention to the global scene and understanding like what's happening, because she needs to know, like if she gets an order from the Schuylkill Arsenal, what's this all about? And then, of course, she made all these flags for the Indian Department, sending them their diplomatic exchange flags, sending them on expeditions. But not only that, when she was older and her house became kind of the capital of her family, and she had nephews who were all seamen. They're writing home from all over the globe. Like, here's a letter from South America. Here's a letter from Holland. And it just like that Betsy Ross in the parlor really gets under my skin because her world, like she had her finger on the pulse of the globe as much as anyone did in, you know, turn of the 19th century Philadelphia, because that was her family's life. They were all over the place. And so I think for us, like it's just something that happens because of the way history gets presented, that we make it smaller than it was. Like popular culture makes it smaller than it was. So all that to say that the same thing is true at 40 acres. So you think about like, I am also very interested in John Morrison, the Scottish gardener. So for those who don't know, during the American Revolution, there was a troop of Scottish Highlanders who come into the Boston Harbor. They're attacked by American forces. The British troops have evacuated Boston, so these guys are on their own. They get captured, and in order to replace absent farm labor, these captives are distributed to the countryside. And John Morrison finds himself at 40 acres and winds up living out his life here. He never goes home. He was trained as an ornamental gardener. He grew up somewhere around Aberdeen, Scotland. He had some job in you know, who knows where ornamental gardens were in northern Scotland at that time, but that was the life he led. And then he found himself at 40 acres and decided to stay. And he again also lives a very troubled life. He descends into alcoholism. He helped me think a lot. I mean, that wound up relating to women and tavern keeping, because I had to think about, you know, what happens when you're part of a system of alcoholism and abuse. And there's a lot of stories about alcoholism and abuse in Hadley and North Hadley. So he opened a lot of doors for me, and thinking about him here with that life trajectory is powerful for me. And then there's this other couple at 40 acres, George and Mary Andrews, also brought to this area through the war. We surmised that he was a Hessian soldier and that Mary was a camp follower. And they wind up tenants at 40 acres, living a very marginal existence. And then there's this heartbreaking story when George dies. And here is Mary Andrews, has followed her husband across the globe. Here they are in Hadley. She barely speaks the language. And there's this heartbreaking story about, where she's just sobbing. What am I going to do? Like the one person that she can talk to has died. And the Phelps family is taking care of her. They nurse her in her final illness. But, thinking about her experience, that's local history too. That happened here, but it's also very much global. And certainly if we think about global trade, all of the stuff that the physical fabric of Hadley in the 18th and early 19th century, that is all the product of global trade, global shipping. And again, people in Hadley were paying attention to all of that. You think about the Hadley men who died in the 7 Years' War, who died in other, military entanglements. Like people watch the global news then just as they do now, because their livelihoods often depended on that.
Time maybe for one or two more questions. So many things. I could keep going always, she says.
Well, it's super interesting stuff. I mean, if there are students in the space who are looking for projects, there's just a never-ending set of possible research projects. Before we leave, if we're closing up, are we wrapping up? I did want to say for Hadley residents in the room, in our space is Cliff McCarthy and Zoe Cheek, and we are all involved in a project that's launching on Saturday. Good waves. Zoe, if you have the link, you want to drop it in the chat to the launch site. Just to let people know, one of the things that we need to know a lot more about here in Hadley and throughout the Valley are the lives and experiences of people of color in enslavement and freedom. And the UMass Public History Program, together with the Pioneer Valley History Network, are starting a big project all summer long in which we hope to recover as much historical documentation as we can from communities all up and down the Valley to start putting that story together in a way that I keep saying is like the whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. Like as each community digs in and learns its history, better and richer, and then we can knit that all together. We're hoping that in time we'll build a much better picture of Black life in the Valley. And so, so Zoe has put up the link. I invite you guys to check it out. Come to the launch thing on Saturday and think about contributing. I'm going to work with any Hadley people who want to participate. So I welcome your call.
So there's a question that just came into the chat asking if you could talk a little bit about the presence of African Americans in New England account books.
Yeah, it is very, as you might imagine, needles in haystacks. You have to look at a lot of things to find that material. You mostly find it when a person of color is sent to the store on behalf of someone else. And so you learn that that person is either enslaved by that person or employed by that person, depending on the time period. Another place that you see a lot of evidence of Black life in the Valley in account books are physicians' account books, because they're going household to household. So there's a lot of information there. Work in early America was dangerous. People got hurt all the time. Women stepped in scalding pots of water. Men were injured in farm accidents. And so there's a cross section of every community in physicians' account books. So if you're aware of those in your community, that is a great place to start looking. In Hadley, there's also, the free Black community shows up a lot in local account books. If you already know the names of the people that you're looking for, you can then also find them in account books if you know first. Account books, unlike other sources, will not normally indicate whether someone is a person of color, but But if you know the names of the free Black community in your town, you're likely to find them in account books. I guess 2 summers ago, there is a person in Hadley's history named Joshua Boston, who's a prominent figure in the free Black community. And I found an account book in Deerfield, where he's just very, very present. And one could certainly put together a picture of his economic life by looking at that. So if you kind of already know some of those names, obviously that expedites things in account books too. It's there. Like I tell this to people all the time, don't let anyone tell you that something is not there. Always look. There wouldn't be women's history if people in the 70s believed that, because we would all be in archives and people would say, well, like Laurel Ulrich tells that great story about the Diary of Martha Ballard up there at the Historical Society in Maine for decades before, and people just dismiss it. It's just pots and pans. Like there's nothing of value in there. But every generation has new questions to ask. They see those documents in new ways. And so always look. Even if someone tells you not to look, you should look.
And right, and ask and think that you can change what you're looking for, that we can keep changing what we're looking for.
Yeah, we will keep changing what we're looking for. How many times, the current example, all of the, ledgers in historical societies that start with weather data, rainy, cloudy, cold, whatever. And no one has done much with that. But now we are seeing powerful things being done with that by people trying to understand the history of climate change. And so, there's content that, people sort of glazed over for a long time, but now is its time. Now it's finding its audience.
Right. And I'll say that about Porter Phelps Huntington materials, and Site 2 is that it's a history of agriculture place, and that means it's a history of climate place.
Yeah.
And it's a history of not just economic evolution, but also ecological evolution.
Yeah. And food systems. When have we are more interested now in food systems than we've ever been before. And all of these agricultural records are also about our food systems. So there's always material that is directly relevant to our current issues.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to end. Thank you all so much for coming. And Marla, thank you for this work. And
I can't thank you enough for letting me do it. This is the great privilege of my career to work in these materials.
so come back.
Thanks everyone for coming.